Okay, I think we have a pretty stable number of folks joining, so thanks so much for coming out on at least here in New England, a beautiful Tuesday evening as the cooler air has come in. My name is Bruce Magnuson. I'm a photographer, and as retired from financial services about 7 or 8 years ago, I've kind of been off on various journeys trying to kind of meld together my interests in art, history, and photography. So I'm sure some of you have probably been to some of my previous presentations, and this one is going to kind of be in that space, more history and photography than art, but we will dabble a bit in some art when we get to some of these locations. But this is Hidden Gems, a photographic journey off the beaten path in New England. And I will also be remiss if I don't thank the Chelmsford Library for hosting the event, and our co-sponsors are the Groton, Groveland, and Tewksbury libraries. As far as housekeeping goes, this is a webinar, so you can't see me, I can't see you, but our means of communication is basically through the Q&A. I will try and be diligent about keeping up with those since we are going to transition from different locations. So I don't want to leave questions from one location when we kind of move on. So as I go through different sections, I will try and make sure that I look at any questions you have, address those as we go forward. And then, of course, there'll be some time at the end for questions. So with that, we will get started. And I promised I would use this new little function I found out in PowerPoint today. But just from an orientation perspective, I know that these webinars do go across the country actually a lot of times. So I can't presuppose that the attendees are familiar with New England, but this is a kind of highlighting of where we're going to be. And we're going to be taking basically a ride through kind of central New England, going from eastern Massachusetts all the way up to southwestern Connecticut, or excuse me, southwestern New Hampshire. And with that, we will talk about our agenda. So we will talk about the Quabbin Reservoir. That's kind of a stage setting for the next two places, Dana Common and the Rutland Prison Camp. And then we will wing our way to the eastern coast of Massachusetts and Cape Ann, and we'll talk about Dogtown. And then we'll swing back and end up in southwestern New Hampshire and talk about Madame Cherie's Forest and Castle. So with that, we will dive into the Quabbin Reservoir. The Quabbin Reservoir, as you saw from the map before, is pretty much almost dead central Massachusetts. And it is right now the water supply for Boston and a lot of the greater Boston area. Survey for the creation of the reservoir began in the early 1900s. It was basically based around the Swift River Valley. Swift River is a river in central Massachusetts. And the plan was to dam up the Swift River, have it fill in the area. It was very much of a valley area, and that was going to create the Quabbin. Its name came from Native American Nipmuc, meaning gathering of the waters, very appropriate. And pertinent to what we're going to talk about, 4 towns were removed, to use a euphemism. They were basically flooded, although one of them didn't end up getting flooded, and that's the one we'll talk about in Dana. But Greenwich, Prescott, and Enfield, those towns were flooded. Basically, the residents had to be removed. It was eminent domain from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so they had the folks move out. They tore down all the buildings. They disinterred and reinterred any of the cemeteries. And then they commenced the flooding. And basically, those 3 towns are at the bottom of the Quabbin Reservoir. Dana was close to where the Quabbin ended up being, but it didn't end up getting flooded. So Dana Common is the only actual place you can visit today that was one of the 4 towns that were removed from the map to make the Quabbin. It was completed in 1939. It took 7 years to fully flood, so it doesn't fully get flooded until after World War II. In 1946, holds 412 billion gallons of water, and is managed famously or infamously, depending upon your point of view, by the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, known colloquially as the MWRA. And so this was obviously, controversial. It happened, the actual creation of it happened during the Depression. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the survey began in the 1900s. And so as we'll see in a second, there was an initial reservoir built, which is the Wachusett Reservoir, which is further east from the Quabbin. And that was created in the early 1900s. And that was, I think at the time, one of the largest, if not the largest reservoir creation in the world. However, at that creation time, the early 1900s, they even knew then that it was going to be obsolete very quickly. So they began surveying, as I mentioned, in the early 1900s for the Quabbin. And the reason I mention that is this obviously has an impact on these four towns because they know they're in the crosshairs. And so gradually, they have to be passed through the legislature. And I think in the 1920s is when this thing all officially gets kicked off, and they have a whole engineering project to survey the land. They have to go through, and like I said, they want to remove a lot of the trees, they want to remove the buildings. All this stuff is a lot of work, and there's a lot of lead time to it. So even though the residents don't actually physically leave until the late 30s, the writing's been on the wall for about 20 years for that. So that obviously was not a great thing for land values because people realized this was going to be flooded at some point in the sooner rather than later. So there is a lot of argument that even though the people were quote unquote given fair market value, at that point the market value had certainly decreased because they were on the chopping block for a long time. So it's a complicated story. I don't pretend that I'm going to go into all the depth of the Quabbin Reservoir. It is a fascinating story of, public works, the kind of the greater public good against some of the impacts that happen to the smaller communities. That being said, it does end up, it's a beautiful spot. This picture here on the right is actually it's actually closed right now. I think it's under renovation, but it's the visitor center and tower at the Quabbin Visitor Center. And it's a really quite interesting place to go out in central Massachusetts. And this is the Windsor Dam, Winsor. That name is actually the chief architect of the whole project. His name Windsor. So he got his name on the dam, and you can walk across the dam. And it says visually, it's an amazing place. It's very peaceful. There's obviously a lot of water. Wildlife has kind of backfilled in there, and it's a very bucolic place in central Massachusetts at this point. But it does have a complicated history. So this is what we're talking about as far as the whole kind of water process of getting Boston the drinking water that it needs. And so you can see here to the west, we have the Quabbin. Dana Common is right at the edge of the Quabbin up here. It goes through, we have this Ware River watershed, which comes into play when we talk about the Rutland prison camps. This is the Wachusett Reservoir that I mentioned, which is dammed up in Clinton. And then there are tunnels that bring the water into Western Metro West in Boston, and it gets distributed to Boston. There was just an article recently, actually, that there is some talk about having the people out in this area actually benefit from the Quabbin, because it is kind of ironic. All this water comes from central Massachusetts, but the towns in and around the Quabbin do not get their water from the Quabbin. So there is some talk about changing that. And as I just saw an article in the paper a couple of weeks ago that might be on tap for the legislature to take up, since it is kind of ironic. Oh, somebody says black and white photo shot in infrared. Yes, somebody's paying attention. So yeah, that's an infrared picture. And infrared is very good in the summer when there are lots of living things like trees and stuff. But yeah, it's a black and white infrared. So as a quick tangent, the Wachusett Dam, which is the one that creates the Wachusett Reservoir, which is east of the Quabbin, that in and of itself is a fascinating place to visit. You can't walk across the dam up here. I think they open it for 2 days a year. You can walk across the Wachusett Dam. However, there's a park here, and it goes actually back up this way, and it's a beautiful spot. I mean, you do have to walk down this hill, and more importantly, you have to walk back up this hill, but there are stairs, and it's a beautiful spot. And I was there this spring. Of course, all the streams around here are pretty much at higher levels because of all the water we've had in the last year. And so there is a stream kind of back here to the left, and it's an amazing place to kind of roam around in, and architecturally and visually, it's quite stunning. So I would definitely suggest if you're out in the area. It's not too far from the Botanical Gardens at Tower Hill. It's really right down the street. So cool place to go in Worcester County. So we will go to Dana Common. So here we are from a orientation perspective. Dana Common is out here right on the eastern edge of the Quabbin. It's kind of a auxiliary area. This is the main body of the Quabbin. And, once again, they weren't quite sure how far things were going to go when they started filling up the valley, I guess. So as a result, they did vacate Dana Common, but it ultimately did not get flooded out. And there are remnants of families. They said they had to leave there in the late 30s. There are certainly people there today who grew up in the area and their ancestors, and they do have reunions. And there is an active community of Dana Common descendants per se, and they put a stone here in the middle of the Dana Common area that I think was from the 1990s, and it's kind of a memorial to the lost town. So a little bit closer. and we're kind of up here, right above the Potaprog Pond, and this is the main part of the Quabbin, and these are kind of auxiliary areas that fill in. And if you're interested in getting there, this is where it gets a little interesting, hence my title, Off the Beaten Track, Beaten Path. You can get there if you put into your GPS, handy dandy GPS, DCR Quabbin Gate 40. It's actually in the town of Petersham in central Massachusetts. Petersham is actually known Harvard Forest. Harvard has a whole facility out there, and they kind of study forest that they use, which is pretty interesting if you're out in the area. But this is the gate that you go to enter the place, and you cannot drive there. There is a broken pavement road that is 1.8 miles that goes from gate 40 to the actual common. And my little piece of advice is the first time we went there, we did walk. So obviously 1.8 miles is in and 1.8 miles is out. So you're talking, a good hour and a half or so just to walk it. When I did it the first time, I said, next time I'm coming back here, I'm going to bring a bike because the path is in fairly good shape. I don't know if the road was, they left there in the late 30s. I can't believe that's pavement from the late 30s, but it's actually in fairly decent shape. There's some gravel. I have a very thin tired road bike. I wouldn't suggest taking one of those. I take something more of a mountain bike, but it's fairly flat. There's, some ups and some hills and stuff like that, but nothing too terrible. So that makes it a 40-minute walk down to about a 10 or 15-minute bike ride. And this is what the gate looks like. I had the place all to myself when I was there about a month or so ago, but it's a beautiful road, goes right in and kind of deteriorates pretty quickly right past the sign. But I said, once again, it's very, very rideable from any kind of just, basic mountain bike perspective. This is actually my daughter's bike that I used, and it worked out pretty well. So much so that I took a video of it. So this is a quick video that kind of gives you a sense that you can see the broken pavement here. And, the road is not in certainly super duper shape, but as far as, trails go and mountain biking, this is really good. And this is the last 100 yards or so as you come up toward the actual common. And they do have a porta potty here. Can be helpful. And you can hear a beep in the background, and that is actually DCR, which is the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which manages this stuff. They used to be the MDC, Metropolitan District Commission. They kind of folded that away about 20 years ago. And there was somebody who was over there the day I was there who was maintaining some of the fields that are off here to the left. And as you can see, this is pretty well maintained as far as any kind of growth. They do cut the lawns. As we'll see in a second, there aren't any buildings here, but it's as far as ease of access, once you get up to this area, it's very easy. We were up there a couple of years ago. There were people actually having a picnic here on the common. But this is basically what Dana Common looks like today. And as you go up the road, this is not a award-winning picture, but what I'm trying to get at is you can see that the offshoots of the Quabbin are pretty close. So even when you're at Dana Common, you really necessarily can't see that you're close to the water, but on the road, if you look up as you're going toward the common on the left, you can definitely see all this blue here. So, it was close, but it never actually ended up getting to the level of Dana Common. And this is the marker that I mentioned at the beginning, which was put there in the 90s to kind of commemorate the folks who basically had their town removed back in the 30s. And it goes off. There are roads. These are all, gravel roads that go back, and there's a whole trail system that goes back into here. But this is the main common you have, and most of the remnants of buildings are off here to the left. But they have signs around that. There's one right here you can see that give you some indication of what was there. And even without all the history of the Quabbin and all that, it is a pretty place. And it's and there's the day I was there wasn't anybody else there, but usually there's a fair number of people who actually go through this, and it's relatively accessible once you know what you're getting into and you're willing to commit the time. But as I said, the buildings were removed and the cellar holes were left, and some of them are fairly elaborate with the stonework. And there was a hotel that was there. There was a general store. There was a church. So there were a lot of buildings at Dana Common. And this is what you have left. I kind of like the evocative view of it with the kind of creepy shadows of the tree. But, you do get a sense certainly of, loss. As you read about it, you understand what's going on, and you kind of come into this place. it is a somber place, and they've done a good job of preserving what's there and telling the story. And it is interesting that the stonework is really interesting. This is, very, very small stones that were done as a wall around a structure. And then there are some basements here, and they have stuff that's left over. I think this may be the one where there's actually a safe that's left from a bank there. So it was really a lot of cases, the people were removed, and they just kind of left what they had there. So you see that in both on the way into the actual common and in the common itself, you'll see remnants there that have things that are left. Now, whether they were there from 100 years ago, I'm not sure. Part of the challenge with these spaces, and we'll see that as we go into some of the other locations, you do have problems with, people bringing trash in and just leaving stuff. There are bigger issues in other places with graffiti. So I'm not entirely sure all these things that are left were actually there from when Dana Common was there, but some of them certainly seem like it, like this here, this old rusted metal can somehow. And this is a different view of that cellar hole. And they do a good job of kind of keeping it, keeping the grass cut and not having it totally overgrown. So you have a sense of what the actual common looked like in its heyday. And once again, this is another remnant of a foundation with some various metal things that are left. And so it's, I said it's relatively accessible as long as you know the whole gate thing. The GPS worked fine in the gate. I'll get into our next place where the GPS didn't work so well, and hopefully give you a tip to avoid what happened to me. But Dana Common, I said, the story of the Quabbin is a very interesting Massachusetts story. It's a very interesting story as far as, the urbanization of the country and kind of what some of the challenges with that is, and then also, some of the infrastructural challenges to support this, and things have to be done. And certainly the Quabbin is not the only reservoir that has had to support a major metropolitan area. I know there's a big reservoir up in the Catskills north of New York City. A lot of different stories that happen, but the Quabbin, certainly with those 4 towns being removed, and I'll get to it at the end. I'll give you some of the sources and further reading if you're really interested in the stories that happen there. There's been actually some relatively recent books that have been written about this, and I think it's getting more publicity per se than it has in the past. Where when I was a kid, my mother actually, when she was I think in college, she worked for a gentleman at the NDC who was kind of putting together the stories of the Quabbin. And this was in the late 40s and the early 50s. I have to admit, I wish he was still around to ask her more questions about it. But I really wasn't that aware of the Quabbin. Quite frankly, wasn't all that interested in the Quabbin. But once you start getting down into the story of that, it's a pretty fascinating place. So before I switch over to our next spot, somebody says, what are the stairs that take you down to the park below the dam at the Quabbin? The dam that I showed was actually the Wachusett, and they were kind of like black things on the left. There's stairs on both sides, and there's a parking, really not really much of a parking lot. There's a road above. You can park on the side of the road right outside the town of Clinton. And then there are stairs right down there that go down. And then the park is pretty elaborate. And so there's a very robust stream that goes along there and some nice walking paths that go along it. And then there's another walking path that you can get up and get a view of the Wachusett Reservoir, which is quite nice. So with that, we'll move a little further east, and we will take a look at the Rutland Prison Camp. So here we have where Dana Common is over here by the Quabbin. Here we have Rutland Prison Camp, which for trivia buffs is the geographic center of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And they tell you that on the sign as you go into Rutland. And as you can see, that kind of makes sense. But the Rutland Prison Camp, this is one of their little placards they have there that describe some of the stuff that went on there. But this was a prison camp. It was minimum security. It was basically done for, a lot of it was public drunkenness, things along those lines, certainly no violent crime. But the interesting and unique thing about it was also a co-op, a cooperative dairy and vegetable farm. So basically they had the inmates who were working at a dairy farm and producing vegetables, so much so that I guess they produced enough milk that they were able to sell surplus. There was an actual state prison, a full-blown state prison in Rutland, and they were providing the milk for that, and they had surplus, so they actually would sell milk to the city of Worcester. So it's a pretty interesting story. This has a different vibe than Dana. They are relatively close to each other, though, so you can hit both of them in a day. My little insider tip here for you, this is the map, and this is the Rutland Prison Camp. These are all dirt/gravel roads. This is a fully paved, I would call normal road called Intervale Road. And then Intervale Road goes off here and becomes a dirt road. So for Apple Maps, they didn't figure that out. And so as you see, the road name just changes. Basically, when you're driving down this road, there was a little pull off here and like a sign thing, and then it does go to a dirt road, but you're kind of cruising along and it only changes to Shamrock Hill Road. And there's no, sign or anything. So the first time I went, I got hopelessly lost and ended up coming actually this way around, which is a very, very great circle route. If you do Google Maps knows this and it figures it out and says, oh, you can go down here. Now, the thing about this road is it is a very hard packed dirt road, so you can drive it without any kind of like super duper all wheel drive or anything. The challenge is the gates are closed in the pretty much late fall through spring. And they did have, we'll see this a little bit later in the presentation, we'll see where some of this road actually got washed out. But the next slide shows you it's about, it's only a 0.6 mile walk, so much shorter than Dana Common. So you only have about 13 minutes to walk from here where the intersection is, the intersection, quote unquote, between Intervale Road and Shamrock Hill Road. And you can just park your car here and walk, and you're into the whole complex here, which is the Rutland Prison Camp. And the Rutland Prison Camp, this is the road that they do block off during the winter months. And I said, certainly in the early spring as well. This goes along and it kind of comes up here, and off to the right is the sanatorium that we'll talk about, and off to the left here is where the dairy farm is. And there are still a few buildings that are left from the Rutland prison, but unfortunately, they're heavily graffitied. So they did a walk actually last November. They have walks at both these places relatively frequently. DCR has free ranger walks that they do all seasons. They have them in the winter as well as the spring, summer, and fall. So I was on one once I got myself back here about 45 minutes late, although they hadn't actually moved that far. You can walk around these remnants of it, but they have had huge graffiti issues. They've talked about, they've tried to, remove the graffiti and police the area, but the graffiti artists at this point have won out. So I think they've kind of thrown up their hands at this point and said, well, this is what it is. And, depending upon your view of graffiti, as we'll see in a second, it can be kind of artful, but it ultimately in this case is vandalism. So oddly enough, one of the buildings that's still left is solitary confinement. And the weird thing about this place was it was minimum security, and they had a pretty good deal. Like I said, they could work at a farm, a dairy farm, or a vegetable farm. They had, very nice accommodations and it's a barracks, a prison type thing, but they had like 3 full meals a day. It was good food. There wasn't a lot of security around it. But if people misbehaved, they did have solitary confinement. And so they have pretty much, I think it's like 6 cells that are solitary confinement. And I guess people being people, they're going to break the rules in some case. And as a result, they had to build this solitary confinement. As you can see, it's kind of falling apart. The roof is coming apart. And once again, it's been a canvas for graffiti. But it is, I mean, it's the one thing I will say about these places, if you're looking for a place to film a horror movie, pretty much all these places that we're going to will fit the bill. I'm not sure how DCR feels about that, but they're pretty remote, and some of these things in the right light and the right sounds, your imagination can start getting away from you. But like I said, unfortunately, it's ubiquitous with the graffiti, so every place pretty much has it. This one did kind of interest me with this creepy kind of it clown type of smile back in one of the solitary confinement cells. And this is built into the side of a hill. This is where they kept their vegetables in a vegetable cellar. This is actually not in great shape. So the tour guide, when I was there, said really it's the structural beams of it aren't great, so don't really go in there if you can avoid it. But obviously graffiti artists have gone in there, but it's it's kind of odd to have that obviously in the landscape and everything, but it does show that this is where they stored the vegetables. And so they had this whole farm there. They were growing these vegetables, and obviously a cooler place to keep the vegetables with the vegetable cellar. And that's one of the few buildings that still survives. The other thing there is the tuberculosis sanatorium. So this is a little bit different in the fact that it was a sanatorium for the whole prison system of Massachusetts. So it was not just a sanatorium for the inmates at the Rutland prison camp. So what this means is it had to be higher security because they basically could take anybody who was in prison from maximum security to the lowest level of minimum security could be an inmate at this place. So as a result, they had to build in a lot more security. And the interesting thing about this is in the times that I've been there in the last 6 months or so, they have done a major tree removal project. So I was there back in November. The place was overgrown. There were trees coming out of everything. And the tour guide did mention that over the winter, they were going to have a project to cut down a lot of the trees and open up the sanatorium because it's a fairly big structure. And sure enough, came back there. They were doing the work back in March and went back in April and they had completed it. And so you can see here what the complex looked like. So this is, a pretty significant edifice. And it had a metal fence, so once again, we're talking with, high security. So everything had to be in place that it could deal with these folks. Obviously, they're sick with tuberculosis, but still, they had committed crimes and wanted to make sure that there were no escapees from it, which I don't think there were. And so this is, this is kind of the outskirts, the perimeter of it. And they've, you can see all the stumps here that they've taken down the trees. These are actually footings. And this was a picture before they took down the trees. These are gone now. But, from a sanatorium perspective, you kind of had this bucolic look over the valley. And this is the Ware River that is in this space here. So it is a very, very nice spot if you're going to, be in a sanitarium for tuberculosis. You certainly do worse than that. And obviously, at the turn of the century, this I think was built in 1907, and the original Rutland prison camp was just built 4 years before in 1903. So, you tuberculosis, as I'm sure you're mostly aware, was pretty prevalent, and there was, a lot of, famous people, Henry David Thoreau, Anton Chekhov, a lot of people, succumbed to tuberculosis, and there was a lot of things in the mountains around New England and upstate New York. I know in the Adirondacks, from the Albany area, in the Adirondacks, there was certainly a lot of things of going and getting the clean air was certainly something that was considered a remedy or at least a mediation for TB consumption. And so these places were built in these kind of spaces. They were out, in the wilderness per se. They were usually looking for some place that had some elevation to get sign of what is considered cleaner air to help the lungs. And some of these things, they had people who would actually, the treatment was to stay outside all year round. So as you can imagine, particularly in the early 1900s, to the 20s and 30s, all year round in central Massachusetts is not for the faint of heart. But they had these, decks, and they had people on basically chase lounges, and they would be out there, all year long, so they could be exposed to the air. Unclear as to how much that really did, but it seemed like it wasn't actually a bad thing. It was better than leeches, I guess. And so this is a remnant of stairs. You kind of see that they did leave some trees here, but they really did clear cut a lot of the space around the sanatorium. There was a cemetery. Like I said, the place was in operation for about 30 years, 31 years. And so they did have a cemetery where inmates who passed away there were buried. And the dairy farm kind of comes into play as to why the Rutland prison camp was shut down. So this is a picture of the dairy farm in 1933, I think, 34, right as the prison camp is being closed down. And the reason it's being closed down is because it is in the watershed of the Ware River, and the Ware River is in the watershed of the Quabbin Reservoir and the Wachusett Reservoir. So as a result, they have all these dairy cattle and horses too. There's a horse barn on the property as well, and all that runoff is going right into the watershed. And so this is going to be a public drinking place. We can't have that. So the Commonwealth closes down this prison in 1934, about 3 or 4 years before they start flooding the Quabbin. Once again, you see this is the Ware River watershed, and it lies right in between the Wachusett Reservoir and the Quabbin Reservoir. So the Rutland prison camp is right in here. And you can see this is the road actually before they actually, this was back in March. And this road had washed away. This is the road I showed you the original picture of going into the Rutland prison camp. It has been since graded over, and they put gravel in and stuff, but this washed away in the storms we had over the winter. But the point of the picture is to show you how close it is to the water. So you have this Ware River watershed right here, and this is literally where the dairy farms here were up in here, so it was very close to it. And as a result, they had to make the decision to shut it down and not have it pollute the watershed. So with that, I don't see any other questions with this section. So as we move along, I mean, the theme of these is that they're off the beaten path. There is also kind of a connecting theme between the first three in Dana, Rutland, and Dogtown, and the fact that water and potable water for a larger population kind of comes into play into the story. So with that, we will head out east to Dogtown, which is on Cape Ann. And any of you folks who have seen previous presentations of mine, I did a presentation on islands off the coast of New England, and Thatcher Island was figured prominently in that, as was Strait Smith. So those are right off of Cape Ann, and you can get to those via boats that run out of Rockport Harbor. And so Cape Ann is technically an island, actually. We'll have another map. We'll get into that a little bit more. But there's this Annisquam River, which really is not a river. It's a estuary, kind of like the East River is down in New York. It's actually not a river, but it's a ocean estuary. So, but this really does isolate Cape Ann, particularly in the early days. Like the Cape Ann, it only has basically one road with a drawbridge up until 1948, when 128 comes into play. And 128 builds a bridge over the Annisquam. It's going today when you take 128 and go into Gloucester and Rockport. I think there's maybe one other road. There's only, I think today, 3 actual bridges that go to Cape Ann. 128 obviously being the big one with 4 lanes that go in there. But for all intents and purposes, it was an island for the first couple 100 years, 300 years of its settlement. And so Dogtown is this area which is in the interior of Cape Ann. And so obviously, when you go to Cape Ann, you were typically going for the coast. Rockport's here, Gloucester is down here, Gloucester Harbor is down in here. Like I said, Thatcher Island, a lot of beaches. This is where Wingershik Beach is, if you're familiar with that, right at the mouth of the Annisquam River. Lighthouse over here, Annisquam Light. So typically when people go to Cape Ann, they're thinking about, maritime stuff and water-based, whale watches, all that. However, the original settlement ends up being in the interior here in what is now called Dogtown. And so one of the reasons it was the original settlement is at the time, there were rumors of pirates, although from what I've read, it's kind of hard to say whether actually were pirates. But certainly, the British, when we were at war with the British and in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, if you were on the coast, you were susceptible. So people kind of came here and congregated here originally for protection. Gradually, as the maritime industries take over, the population migrates down to Gloucester and out to Rockport. I think Rockport separates as a separate city in the 1840s. But Gloucester dates back to 1630 something, I think 36. So this ends up being kind of abandoned to a certain degree. And obviously Dogtown is not a great nickname, although I guess it turns out there are dog towns like all over the place in the United States. It's not really too hard to find a dog town in most states, but there's various ideas as to why it was called Dogtown, because eventually the population moves out. It becomes kind of a hardscrabble place. Supposedly, like widows from the Revolutionary War are living there. There's rumors of witches, which of course you're up here in the Salem area. Basically becomes a place for, lack of a better term, the downtrodden. And the story was there was just a lot of wild dogs running around, so therefore got the pejorative name Dogtown. And it's got an interesting history. And it's a large area. It's about 5,000 acres. There's a lot of debate and some as to who actually owns parts of it. It's not really that the town of Gloucester, or city of Gloucester, does own portions of it, but I think there are still parts of it that are ambiguous to who actually has ownership of it. So it's this kind of, wild place, in a place that a lot of us, consider not very wild. I mean, this is, a very big tourist destination. You have Halibut Point up here, obviously you have Rockport and Gloucester, but this place is really quite wild, and it's got a very checkered history. And we will start with a geological talk about it, because that plays into exactly what the terrain is looking like. And so, as I'm sure a lot of folks are aware, a lot of the topography in New England and northern United States is defined by the glaciers, or a glacier, particularly the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada, if not all of Canada, and the northern part of the United States, most notably New England and up here in the upper Midwest. Interesting little point here. This area in Wisconsin is called the driftless area because this area, for whatever reason, did not get covered by the ice sheet. So my brother actually lives in Green Bay out here, and we were visiting this area, and everybody's talking about the driftless area, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And as you look at these maps, even this one's a little bit more dramatic. For whatever reason, this particular area of Wisconsin did not get covered by a glacier, and therefore it has a very, very different geologic lookout than the rest of the state does. But we're concerning ourselves here with New England and what happens with glaciers and how it pertains to Dogtown in particular and Cape Cod generally. So this is the last ice sheet, probably around 14, 15,000 years ago. And one of the terms you end up with is called terminal moraine, which is a ridge-like accumulation of glacial debris that marks the farthest reach of the glacier. And so you kind of see right here is Cape Ann, and you see the farthest reach of the glacier is right here. So as a result, this particular place, and Dogtown's kind of the highest point on Cape Ann, you end up with a lot of rocks. And they're called erratics, which are large boulders that have been moved from different areas. And so that creates a lot of the terrain that you're dealing with in Dogtown. It makes it a very, very forbidding place and foreboding place. And so this is more of a graphic illustration here. And you had this kind of end moraine, terminal moraine of what's going on as glacier retreats. And these things wash up. And you have these kettle, which are all over New England, all over the Cape Cod, actually. You see a lot of these kettle ponds. I think actually Walden Pond is kind of sort of a kettle pond. And you end up with this at the edge. And so when you go to Dogtown, it's pretty dramatic, as we'll see. And our friend, Mr. Thoreau, he gets around in New England. He ends up in a lot of places. It's kind of interesting. And of course, he writes about it, and he does spend time in Dogtown. And he says, we could see no house, but the hills strewn with boulders as if they had rained down on every side, we sitting under a shelving one. When the moon rose, what had appeared like immense boulders half a mile off on the horizon now looked by contrast no larger than nutshells or burry nut against the moon's disk, as she was the biggest boulder of all. So you end up going to Dogtown. There's different entrances to Dogtown. This is probably the main one. And this is what you're faced with. So once again, when you go into any kind of wooded area in New England, you're typically, obviously you're going to see stones, rocks, and you have the whole thing with obviously stone walls throughout New England, an incredible common sight, and there's a reason for that because as farmers were pulling apart their fields, either make them grazing or planting places, they had to remove stones. Supposedly, if the small stones are on the bottom, it's more of a agricultural field. If there's large stones, it's more of a grazing field. But Dogtown does become a grazing area. It's a common, so it's like, just like Boston Common, people had rights to graze their cattle on the common and things along those lines. And so that happened in Dogtown as well. But what that does is keep the vegetation down. So as a result, you have a pretty barren place. So now we have, these rocks today with a lot of trees, and there have been certain people who are actually consciously planting trees in and above what Mother Nature happened. But this is a story pretty consistent throughout New England. If you go back to Thoreau's day, back in the mid 1800s, New England is far less forested than it is today. I think some of the numbers are like 80% less forested because it was all farmland. It's either farmland from raising crops or from grazing animals, most notably sheep. And it looks very different today. You could see a lot farther back then, and your vistas from places weren't really blocked by trees. And so over time, those trees have come back in most cases. But it's kind of interesting that it was really quite a different topography, 100, 150 years ago. And this are some old pictures of Dogtown that kind of give you a sense of, excuse me, what it might have looked like or did look like when these animals, these are pigs, obviously, we have cattle over here, were munching down anything that was going to grow up. So Dogtown has this incredibly barren view. Today it's very overgrown. Obviously, the rocks are still there, but it was quite a different topography, 100 years ago or so. And on top of that, we'll get to this in a second. There were people who actually carved things in stone. This is Dogtown Square as you walk Dogtown Road. And this is just pretty much the vista as you're walking around Dogtown. It is just boulders everywhere. I say it's quite dramatic. Once again, New England landscape is not short of boulders. The neighborhood I live in Chelmsford, certainly has a ton of them, but nothing like this. And this is, really, really quite dramatic. Very dramatic. And once again, some of these things are, these are serious size boulders. This is, erratic, which, as I mentioned before, are large rocks that have been moved from other places. They can move hundreds of miles, and they get dropped down when the glacier melts. Basically, the rock is in the glacier, and as it melts, it kind of drops down. And once the glacier is melted away, the rock is left where it is. And you can see that the trees are very adaptable and they grow around it. And so you have these, trees that literally hug these boulders. This one kind of looks like it's actually keeping it from falling over, but it's quite dramatic, quite dramatic. There are very significant rocks that are in the area. So to kind of switch gears and get a little bit more into what I was talking about as far as the theme goes, Cape Ann's an island, and there's this little place here, which is a little canal, and it's called the Cut. And this is what really officially made Cape Ann an island. This is a very, very smaller version of the Cape Cod Canal, but basically this is a canal to go into Gloucester Harbor, and this is what made it total water from the mainland. And as I mentioned, there was a bridge across the Cut. There's a drawbridge, was the only way on to Cape Ann until 128 comes into play about 1948. So what happens is, in 1930, there was I can't think of the term now, a water carrier going across, a pipe, thank you, was a pipe going across that brought water into Cape Ann at this point, both Gloucester and Rockport. So in 1930, that springs a leak. And as a result, they have to scramble to try and get water to the folks on Cape Ann. And so they come up with the idea of, let's do a mini version of the Quabbin. You basically dam up a river. I think this is called Alewife Brook at one point, and they create what's called Babson Reservoir. And so we'll get into Mr. Babson, and he has a very big influence on Dogtown and what ends up happening in Dogtown and some of the kind of the odd things you can see today. But he ends up being involved with, I think, donating some of the land, and they end up damming up this river and creating a reservoir in 1930. And then from a capacity perspective, kind of like the story with the Quabbin, you had the Wachusett first, then you had the Quabbin. They need to get more water, so they dam up another tributary and end up creating the Goose Cove Reservoir. So you have, these are the two main reservoirs that today provide water for Cape Ann. But it was pretty remote. It's hard today to kind of envision that. You go up 128 and you end up, and there's no shortage of cars every time I'm up on Cape Ann, but it's kind of hard to envision, 70, 80 years ago, that wasn't the case, and it was not nearly as traveled as it is today. And certainly you can see 128 right here, which is Great Circle and Blackburn Circle. And so Great Circle is the one that goes over the Annisquam. So as a result, we have these reservoirs that are created. And this is the way they are. This was taken a while ago, as you can see. It is actually frozen over, which isn't all that frequent anymore, but they are there in Dogtown, and the rocks are kind of strewn everywhere. So once again, there's no shortage of rocks anywhere you go in Dogtown. And these are some shots of some of the reservoirs that are basically kind of the northern and southern edges of Dogtown are kind of barriered by the reservoir, the Goose River on the top and the Babson on the bottom. But speaking about Babson, we have our friend Roger Babson. And so Mr. Babson, 1875 to 1967, he was an economist, an entrepreneur, a business theorist. He had like a column in the paper. He gave financial advice, was an investor himself. Probably the most folks here in Massachusetts are aware of him. He's the namesake of Babson College. I think he created a couple of other colleges, but Babson is the most noteworthy. And he actually sold or donated over 1,000 acres of what is today Dogtown. So he had bought that a while ago, and even the part he sold, he did sell it below, below market prices. And his comment about these stones we're going to take a look at here is, the work I'm doing is part of an educational plan, which will take me years to complete. I believe young people, when outdoors, should see something besides advertisements to smoke certain brands of cigarettes and to use certain soaps to return that schoolgirl complexion. So he was quite a character. He actually ran for president in 1940. I forget what party it was. I believe it was a third party, but he was running against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. But he has a large impact on what we see in Dogtown today. And we have what's called the Babson Boulder Trail. So as we see here, once again, this is the Babson Reservoir. That sign I showed you about the entrance into Dogtown, that's up here. Excuse me, this is another entrance on the southern end. You get into Dogtown, and you can get into the Babson Boulder Trail. And what that means is that all these names here are carved into rocks all along this trail. So he had this, kind of interesting idea that if you're walking through the woods and you see some sort of inspirational thing like be clean, that's gonna, make you think about being clean, I guess, as opposed to smoking cigarettes. And this is a list of all of them, and it's pretty interesting. And so they're still there. They were carved, even though after he donated the land for Dogtown, he did reserve the ability to still carve the stones. And it was a multi-year project during the Depression. I think he was actually giving stonemasons work as well, but they're there. And so when you go through various trails, mostly Dogtown Common and Dogtown Road, rather, and obviously the Babson Boulder Trail, you'll come upon these stones that have these different either words or phrases carved upon them, and it is definitely different. A lot of I words, and once again, these rocks are huge for the most case. But it's just intelligence. I don't know whether you're seeing a rock with intelligence on it makes you smarter, but that was kind of his theory. Spiritual power as well. And there was a little bit of graffiti. I guess years ago there was quite a lot of graffiti, and Dogtown does have a checkered history. It was really quite the place, of a wild place as far as parties and people doing all kinds of stuff, and it was kind of a place that was just off the beaten path and nobody paid much attention to it. So all kinds of ne'er-do-wells went up there, and unfortunately there was a notorious murder there back in 1984 where a school teacher was actually murdered by a local, and that really kind of galvanized in a weird way a more of a focus on Dogtown and a more concentrated preservation effort to Dogtown. It was very unfortunate it took something like that to do that. But since the 80s, there has been a lot less of that. And there were a lot of graffiti there. They were able to get the graffiti off. It has not come back, fortunately, but unfortunately, like Rutland Prison Camp, it has, and they've been able to keep this a lot more pristine than the Rutland Prison Camp. And use your head's one of my favorite ones. So they weren't great with spacing between the words, but this is the interesting one. This is a twofer. You got one on each side, but study on one side and be on time on the other. But it's just an oddity. There's no doubt about it. And we'll end up in Dogtown with our little bit of a foray into art. So the painter Marsden Hartley had Dogtown as a subject matter in some of his paintings. He was a Maine-based modernist painting, pretty famous in his time. He was a contemporary of George O'Keeffe, Arthur Dove, and Alfred Stieglitz, who was George O'Keeffe's husband, and a very groundbreaking gallery owner in New York, particularly around photography, but he also did a lot with modernist painting. And so the trio of George O'Keeffe, Arthur Dove, and Marsden Hartley, a lot of their work was displayed. And Hartley became enamored with Dogtown. He had a very checkered life. He was gay, had a lot of challenges with that, had a lot of psychological challenges. And he really kind of bonded with Dogtown, and it's kind of wildness, and it's unpredictability, and a lot of different things that people kind of project onto Dogtown. And he visited there 3 times over the course of about 14 years and created a number of paintings. There was a show back at the Cape Ann Museum, which is in Gloucester. Wonderful museum if you get a chance up that way. It's got a lot of interesting things in it, and was noted with Edward Hopper and Fitzhenry Lane, the luminist landscape and oceanscape artist. But they had a show of Marsden Hartley's work back in 2012 called Soliloquy in Dogtown, and there is an exhibit catalog that's available. You can check that out. And once again, people's quotes about Dogtown are never, glowing. There's always some sort of challenge with it. It's a complex place. His seagulls fly over it on their way from the marshes to the sea. Otherwise, the place is forsaken and majestically lonely, as if nature had at last formed one spot where she can live herself alone. So you have a lot of, really kind of deep emotional bond with some artists into Dogtown. The poet Charles Olson, who was one of, I think, he actually was the one who coined the term postmodernist. He was also a very um, big uh, influencer from Dogtown, and his Maximus odes he had, which were kind of seminal in postmodern poetry, aren't really talked a lot about today, but they were influencers on the Beat generation. He was up in Dogtown as well, and a lot of his poems actually deal with Gloucester. But Marston Hartley dealt with it in a visual way, and this is one of his more famous paintings, Mountains of Stone. And these are two other ones which are, visually arresting. I mean, once again, it's a very, very, rough place, and you can project all kinds of different auras onto it, and he certainly did that. So the last one we'll end up in is Madame Cherie's Forest/Castle, and this one will take us up into southwestern New Hampshire. So this is Madame Cherie. She's right near Brattleboro, and Keene is up here to the northeast. So don't want to do that. And this is Madame Cherie's castle, what's left of it. So the area it's southwestern New Hampshire, and it's basically called the Monadnock region because of Mount Monadnock. And it's kind of hard to go around that area without seeing Mount Monadnock, and it dominates the view, and it's a pretty interesting place. I will say a lot of artists went up there. There's a lot of history. Obviously, our friend Thoreau made it up to Monadnock numerous times, wrote about it in various places. And once again, his view from Monadnock was quite a bit different than ours because a lot of the land was actually cleared. But then you have Peterborough, which of course was the McDowell artist colony. You have Thornton Wilder's Our Town. A lot of artistic legacy up in this neck of the woods, and a lot of beautiful physical beauty. And you have Pisgah State Park, which is a gem of a state park up there. So there's a lot to see and do up in the Monadnock region and southwestern New Hampshire. But the one we're going to specifically talk about is Madame Cherie's Forest and Castle. And this is, once again, we're on a packed gravel/dirt road. When you do the GPS on it, it comes up a little warning saying, route includes dirt road, and it is true. And you're on a dirt road for a good mile, I think a mile to 2 miles. And it's, it's a packed dirt road. I mean, I wasn't up there on a pouring rainstorm, but, it is a dirt road. There are houses up there, but is, at least in my estimation, a bit off the beaten path. And, she built this castle per se, over 100 years ago. So even back then, it probably was a bit more remote. And so when you go to Madame Cherie Forest, they have all kinds of information about it. It's a little map of the area. If you're a trivia buff, Hinsdale, New Hampshire has the longest continually operating post office in the country from like 1803 or something. So that's its claim to fame. That's up in this neck of the woods here in southwestern New Hampshire. And this is kind of the story of Madame Cherie. This is a picture of Madame Cherie, and this is a little bit closer view. And she is French, grew up in France, but comes to the United States as a singer and dancer. And she moves to New York and opens up some couture houses where she and her husband are designing colorful costumes for royalty and theater. And they're also producing shows on the vaudeville circuit, including the Ziegfeld Follies. And one of their proteges, Charles Lemaire, becomes a legendary costume designer, nominated for Academy Awards. And her husband passes away in 1924 with his premature death. But she ends up, this guy Lemaire ends up kind of becoming her benefactor throughout her life. And there's quite a social scene and art scene up in this neck of the woods. Who knew? In Chesterfield, New Hampshire, back in the Roaring '20s. And so as a result, she builds this house. It's called Madame Cherie's Castle, although that's a bit of an overreach, but it's a nice looking house. We'll see in a second. And she hosts all kinds of parties up there. It becomes kind of this, famous place where all kinds of, various Broadway people and stuff are making their way up there. And once again, you do have the rusticator tourist trade that's going up into the mountains, getting away from the heat of the city, all that kind of stuff, which you see certainly in the White Mountains, in this area, which is kind of in between the Whites and the Green Mountains. And then you have the Adirondacks over to the west, even the Catskills to a certain degree. Those are escapes from the city heat. So these places have very, very lively social scenes, particularly in the summertime. So, her house gets built in the 30s. Unfortunately, she does end up kind of falling on hard times. She moves out of the house and ends up going into decay and ends up becoming a ruin. But this is how it looked in its heyday. And so take a look at this because we'll see what's left. But this is basically its main architectural feature here, the sweeping staircase with this arch here, and then it goes into the house. And as you can see, the house is not huge. I mean, it's definitely a very interesting house, but it's not a castle like some of the castles like a Breakers or something like that, or Biltmore out in Nashville. But it's a very interesting house in this particular neck of the woods. So this is what we have as the house as it stood in its heyday, and this is we have it today. Once again, these are black and white infrareds for the gentleman who asked about it. But this is the excuse me, original staircase into the front. This is that sweeping staircase on the side. And what happened during COVID, there was another arch up here, and it has since fallen down. And you can see right here, this arch here has a pretty good crack in it. So I think if you want to go see this, any semblance of kind of this unique ruin, probably want to get there sooner rather than later, because I don't think this is going to survive too many freeze and thaw cycles. But this is what you have as far as what looks at Madame Cherie's. And this place, once you get to the actual trailhead for this place, it's not the 1.6 miles you have at Dana Common or even the half mile you have it at Rutland prison camps. It's a couple hundred yards up off where the parking is across the little wooden bridge, and you're up into this area. But once again, there's a lot of hiking trails, a beautiful spot, and an awful lot of things you can do is than just look at the ruins. But a little bit like the Rutland prison camp, a little bit of graffiti. This is kind of the basement or the first level of storage area. It's in disrepair. And this is the upper, as you come up here from the sweeping staircase, you kind of come up. And once again, when you're standing there, it really isn't that big a footprint. But I'm always kind of enamored with these things and, kind of what's left in the wilderness. And I do think that the black and white infrared gives it a little bit more of kind of a creepy aura, which I think it deserves. And, this is what you end up with looking at. And as I mentioned before, it is kind of in a bucolic spot. This is a beaver lodge right here in the pond that's right off the side as you walk the trail up to the ruins of the castle. And, the area is just beautiful. And there's a ton of stuff to do in southwestern New Hampshire. And, certainly a lot of artistic locations as well. Mark Twain actually was up in that neck of the woods as well at some point during the, later 1800s. So with that, where to find me? I'm on Instagram at bmagphoto, on Facebook at Bruce J. Magnuson Photography, and on the web at brucemagnuson.smugmug.com. This is me up at a drive-in outside of Burlington, Vermont, waiting for the eclipse. So it was a very interesting experience of photographing the eclipse while this is actually one of the drive-in theater screens behind me over here. So that was kind of a neat little experience there a month and a half ago. As I mentioned before, there actually is a fair amount of recent literature that's been written about this, both fiction and nonfiction. It's a couple of books, nonfiction, about the Quabbin Before the Flood was written in 2021, and Lost Towns of the Swift River Valley was written in 2022. And then there's a novel written about, the town. It's an interesting novel because it does go through the main character is a resident of one of these towns that's about to be flooded. And so it goes into all the angst that happens as you're basically a place you've known throughout your life is going to be, for all intents and purposes, wiped off the face of the earth. And it's called Beside Still Waters by Jacqueline Lynch. And Dogtown itself has a fairly decent literary legacy. I will say Dogtown, Death and Enchantment, and New England Ghost Town. This is pretty much everything you need about Dogtown. Very well written, very interesting, very engaging. It does start with that murder that happened in 1984 and kind of expounds both forwards and backwards as to a lot of the challenges that have happened in Dogtown over the centuries. It's been around for over 300 years. And there was a novel called The Last Days of Dogtown written by Anita Diamant. And lastly, if you're into photography, I will say we kind of have a bountiful riches here in central New England is the Addison Gallery out in Andover. There are two photographic shows there, Robert Frank and Todd Wells Across America, 1955. If you're not familiar with Robert Frank, it's probably one of the most famous series of photographs in American art. And so that's an amazing opportunity to see that. And they also have on the second floor a long arc photography in the American South since 1846, which is once again really interesting, going back from very old photographs to contemporary photographs. And then, speaking of contemporary photographs, the Worcester Art Museum has new terrain, 21st century landscape photography. I have not seen that yet. I'm supposed to go to it tomorrow. So I'm excited about that. It's 30 images of contemporary landscape, of which this is one. That's on view through July 7th. And the ones at the Addison are on view through July 31st. So with that, I will, as we come on the 8 o'clock hour, take any questions. Let me see here. Do I have a few I have to go through? Thank you, Mr. Davis, for the kind words. But if you have any other questions you want me to answer, pop them in the Q&A, and I'll be more than happy to take a stab at it. I see some folks who, oh, okay, people put where they're from, mostly Massachusetts, which makes sense. Question, will the recording be sent to registered people? That is my understanding, yes. Connecticut, people from New Hampshire, which is always good. San Jose, California. Well, it must be a transplanted New Englander, but glad they were there. Somebody, I was expecting somebody would have some relation. Somebody did say their great grandfather had a farm in Greenwich, which is how you pronounce it, I believe. It's not Greenwich. And it was taken, is now underwater. And then his orchard behind the house is now Mount Pomeroy, which is an island. That's interesting. Yes, there are other friends of the Quabbin trying to preserve it. Oh, somebody asked if my mom worked for Edward Rose Snow. She did not work for Edward Rose Snow. I actually met Edward Rose Snow at one point. Interesting guy, and I do talk about him when I did my island lore presentation, because he is kind of the godfather of the lighthouses, and he used to play Santa Claus and go out and distribute gifts at Christmas time to various lighthouses along the New England coast. And I actually used to narrate tours out of Boston Harbor, but that was not the gentleman she worked for. I wish I could find out who it was. Okay. So somebody said, did the arch fall because it's caught COVID? No, it did not. Thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, let me just check here if there's any. Where is the best place to enter Dogtown that is easy? I would say it's called Cherry Lane, Cherry Street. If you Google that picture I showed of the entrance to Dogtown with the town, it has a little mailbox for maps, although there were no maps there. There is a shooting range right there, so you kind of know you're at that location when you can hear all the gunfire, which is a little disconcerting walking through the woods there. But that'd be the one I would suggest. There is parking there, and it's a fairly easy walk in. When you walk in, they have used it as a like a compost place. So, when people put bags of leaves out, I guess that's where they end up, in this huge compost pile. And to the left of the pile is Dogtown Road. And if you walk that, then you'll end up going towards the common, and you end up eventually with the Boulder Trail. I mean, those kind of things, Dogtown's notorious for getting lost in. And I was a bit paranoid the times I've been up there. And I didn't really go off didn't improvise too much, because it does have a reputation of being kind of difficult to navigate through. So I stayed pretty close to what I showed you on there. But if you do go off, I mean, with this day with GPS and all trails and stuff like that, you can probably find your way out of it. But it does have a notorious reputation as being kind of a convoluted place. And I'm not sure the trails are all that well marked. And somebody said, do I use infrared film or a setting on a digital camera? I actually have a digital camera that is converted to infrared. What that means is there's a filter in front of your sensor that filters out infrared light for a regular, visual light camera. You can pay about $250 to have a camera with that filter removed, and it makes your sensor an infrared sensor. And you want to do that with a mirrorless camera, not a DSLR, because a mirrorless camera, you can focus and look right through the viewfinder, and what you see is what you get. With the DSLR, it's more complicated. So once mirrorless has become more prevalent in the last probably 5 to 6 years, it makes infrared photography a lot easier. I mean, infrared is a whole nother can of worms, and there's complexity about developing it, processing and post-processing and stuff like that. But if you do it through the digital way, you do have to kind of reintroduce the glow of infrared, because when you do it with film, there was the way the processing and the chemicals happen, there was a glow to it. So a lot of people, when they see infrared and don't see a glow, they're like, oh, that must be something different. But if you do take a native digital image with infrared, it actually won't have that glow. But that's probably more about infrared than you ever wanted to hear. But it's great for summer, because you need a lot of light, you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of foliage, and it usually, for black and white, it shows up white, and it gives kind of an ethereal view to it. I specifically took my infrared camera. For the first time I took infrared photographs this year was actually up at Madame Shree a few weeks ago, because I figured the leaves at that point had leafed out, and it would give kind of an interesting take on it, which I think it worked. It's up to the beholder, I guess, but it's an interesting thing to put in your arsenal. And it's, I say it's good for summer, which, here in New England, noontime in summer can be tough because the sun is so harsh and everything, but it's perfect for infrared. Okay, I think that is it. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you for the accolades, and have a great evening.